Hi, we're going to do Chapter 9, Homework 8, and don't forget it's worth double because the next class is the test. Now, depending on when you have me, if you have me on a blue day, the test is going to be Thursday, or if you have me on a gold day, it's going to be Friday. Okay, so make sure you know every question on this test, and again, remember, it's worth double. Now, let's do it. Let's get to the question. So it says, write out sine, cosine, and tangent ratios for angle x and angle y. So we've been talking about the fact that we could make the reference angle either angle, and that's going to control which trig function we use. And we're also learning that we could probably use all three. But when we're first learning about these things, sometimes only one of them works. Other times they all work. So I just have to pick one. Okay, so when I look at this question, this picture, I'm going to use my reference angle as y, and I'm going to use that to fill this in here, okay? So I'm going to label this based on my reference angle y. So all the way back in our old homework, that's opposite. This would be hypotenuse. This would be adjacent. Okay, so based on this reference angle, the sine of y is, the sine is opposite hypotenuse. So the sine of y is 7 over the square root of 53. Okay, now all it wanted me to do is write out these ratios. So I'm going to leave that just like that. Bam. Okay. Now what would the cosine be? Well, the cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So the cosine is 2 over the square root of 53. Now we learned in previous chapters that you're not really supposed to leave the square root of 53 on the bottom. But for today, we're going to leave it like that. Technically, that's not the right way to leave your answer, but we're going to leave it at that today. Okay. And tangent. So the tangent of y is opposite over adjacent, so that'd be 7 over 2. Okay. Done. Now, I'd like to do the question and use z as my reference angle, but I've already marked that up. So my suggestion would be to just rewrite the triangle over here. So the triangle is XYZ, and this is a 2, and that's a 7, and the hypotenuse is a square root of 53. Okay. So now they want me to write out the trig functions in relation to angle z. Okay, well, in relation to angle z, I have different, now the number 2 is opposite angle z. This is still the hypotenuse because it's opposite the box, right? And this is the adjacent side. So when I write out these trig functions, now it's going to look a little different, and this will allow us to compare. That's why this question is pretty cool. Okay, so in relation to z, if I find the sine of z, I go opposite hypotenuse. So that's 2 over the square root of 53. And I'm going to leave my answer with the square root in the denominator. For now, cosine of z. So the cosine of z is adjacent over hypotenuse. So the cosine of z would be 7 over the square root of 53. Awesome sauce. Okay, and then last but not least, we have the tangent of z. So the tangent of z would be 2 over 7, opposite over adjacent. Now the reason why we wrote these out is because as part of your homework, I wanted you to notice some patterns. Notice, depending on the angle we picked, these are reciprocals of each other. Also notice, depending on the angle we pick, these are a match and these are a match. And I think that might make sense to some of us. It's like, oh, okay, well, this was the opposite for angle y, but the number 7 was actually adjacent for the letter z. So these are actually the same number, and you should actually expect that. These are the same number, and you should expect that. And these are actually reciprocals. Okay, pretty cool. Now let's get back to doing math. It says solve the trig function, solve for x round to the 10th. Okay, so see I'm solving for a side. So this is just like homework 6. So if you want to go back in your notes, again, if you're solving for a side, I don't know what your day's labeled, but it looks like this. Solve for a missing side, you want to use this notes. Okay, so my reference angle, this would be opposite, this is adjacent, nothing here at the hypotenuse. So I need tangent function. So the tangent of 40 is 7 over x. I'm going to swap the spots. Okay, and then just type that in the calculator. Don't forget to hit the equal sign. So I'd round that to 8.3. I'm going to put my answer. We're practicing for the test, so we definitely want to put our answer in the answer box. Okay, question number 2, I'm solving for a side. So it's still like homework 6, still like this foldable, solving for a missing side. So we got a reference angle. Nothing is over here at the opposite side. This is my hypotenuse, that's adjacent. Okay, so I need cosine. The cosine of 30 is adjacent over hypotenuse. Let's swap those spots and type it in the calculator. There we go. Round to the nearest 10, so that'd be 18.5. Make sure to get ready for the test. I put my answer in the answer box. Solving for a side. So still this same foldable. I'm not solving for an angle. So here's my reference angle. There we go, right? So it looks like I need sine, because sine of 32 degrees would be opposite over hypotenuse. Swap these spots. Put it in the calculator. 17 divided by 32, sine, enter, 32.1. Now we're also practicing for the test. So we would actually just look at our answers, make sure we, look at each one of our answers, make sure we rounded properly. We also want to look back in our picture. If we plugged it back in, does it make sense? So I'm going to plug our answers here back into the problem. Okay, so this says 8.3. So if this is 8.3, does it make sense? Okay, so the small side is 47. This would be 50. So actually, I think it does make sense that this side would be bigger than that side because the angle opposite it is a little bit bigger. And those are similar. 40 and 50 are pretty close numbers. 7 and 8 are pretty close numbers. So that number totally makes sense. If I plug this back in, 18.5, I think that makes sense. Our hypotenuse has to be the longest side. So 18.5 is longer than 16. Looks good. Plug this back in. 32.1. Okay, so I think that makes sense. If one of the sides is 17, the hypotenuse is the longest side, so it is 32 is bigger than 17, and that makes sense. And the reason why is because 90, it's opposite the angle 90, so 90 is bigger than 32, so that side should be longer. Sweet. Now here's the tricky one. Question 4 and 5 asks for 2 things. And so when they ask for 2 things, they have to have 2 variables. So I already put those variables in there for you. And so you're going to take this one question at a time. Imagine I just asked for W. And if you don't like the letter W, you could change the letter, but let's just use W so we're all on the same page. So I'm going to call this my reference angle, and I'll label this opposite hypotenuse. So we need the trig function of sine. Okay? So the sine of 42 is opposite over hypotenuse. Now I'm not going to switch spots. In fact, I'm just going to multiply both sides by 20. Because if I multiply this side by 20, I get W by himself on one side. This I got to type in the calculator. So 20 times 42 sine, enter. That's what I want. It says round to the nearest tenth. Okay, 13.4. Round the length to the nearest tenth. So that's 13.4. Okay. Now, I have to think about this triangle. So relative to this triangle, we could think of this as theta. I'm solving for a missing angle. here, this is opposite. So that's actually opposite of theta. And this is a box, and this would be the hypotenuse of this second triangle. So I actually need sine again, because opposite is now 13.4, and the hypotenuse is 22.2. Now here's a tip. You want to keep that in your calculator. Don't round it yet. It's already in there, so it actually saves you some time. Okay, so let's set this up. The sine of angle theta, or you could call that x, the sine of theta, is opposite, which is that 13.3826, yada, yada, yada. Keep that in your calculator. Don't round them yet. That's W, but we solve for W, and the hypotenuse is 22. So to sign for theta, which is what they called x, to solve for theta or x, we're going to take the inverse sign of that fraction. Okay, so 13.38, yada, 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 divide by 22. Okay, so that's already in our calculator. Now I'm going to divide by 22, enter. And so that's my trig ratio. And then I'm going to do second sine. Bam, there's my angle. It says round the angle to the nearest degree. So that number, 37.4, says the 4, I'm going to keep it 37 degrees. Okay, now last step, we're going to plug this back in, make sure everything makes sense. So that's 37 degrees, 13.4. I think the number 13.4 is less than 22, and the number 13.4 is less than 20, and so those make sense. I think those